Good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, wherever you are in the country. We're very excited to be able to talk to you today about, as Bob mentioned, crisis management plus diversity and inclusion equals a winning formula. Having been in this work for over 30 years, we've seen so many crises, and people come up to us and say, well, like, how do you respond to this crisis? How do you respond to that crisis? How do we begin to look at this proactively around how these two can be linked together, hopefully from a standpoint of preventing some of these crises, preparing the organization, and then hopefully creating an environment where these no longer take place. Our work historically has been about achieving outcomes. How do we become a better organization because we're doing the work of diversity and inclusion? But at the same time, it's so important for us to realize if we do this work well, we can avoid some of these crises that have been taking place, and so many have been taking place recently. So we're very excited to be involved with you on this discussion and kind of move through it and work with my colleague, Vanessa Vaughn from Asfalis, who is creating a new partnership with us, which we're very excited about. She's in this work, she's committed to this work, has a similar level of passion to us. So we look forward to doing big things together, okay? Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Kaleidoscope Group. I know many of you may know, but we're a full service diversity and inclusion consulting firm, headquartered in Chicago, building a new office in the Charlotte area to expand our reach. We work globally in this space. Currently led by myself. Again, I've been doing this work for 30 enjoyable years of trying to make a difference. And we've assisted organizations in this space for that amount of time, really looking at how do we help organizations maximize the potential of all of their people. We have strategic partners that help us. One of those, again, is Asfalis, which we'll be talking about today. And we're also a certified minority-owned business enterprise. So I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa to talk a little bit about her firm before we get underway.
Well, thank you, Doug, and thanks for the warm introduction. I'm excited to be a part of today's conversation, and I look forward to being a contributor. Just to give you guys a little bit of background as to our firm, a little bit more about myself, and then we'll jump into today's conversation. So Asfalis is actually the Greek word for secure, and we essentially develop resilient DNAs in the global market by turning trauma into triumph each and every day. We help our customers to stretch without breaking, to absorb the impact and to bounce back. And the reason why is we're helping them to rebuild a resilient culture. And we do that by providing crisis management and business continuity, training, planning, and consulting services. One of the things that makes us pretty unique is that we've added disruptive innovation and design thinking as a partnership, because typically in our world, people try to shy away from disruption, but we embrace it so that we can plan appropriately and give our leadership teams an opportunity to mitigate against that. I've actually been in the industry for over 11 years. My background is in Homeland Security and emergency management. It started on the government side. I've transitioned over to the corporate side and have done anything from terrorism mitigation to crisis management and business continuity, global implementations. We have a team of 10, and their background spans from crisis communications, corporate security, information security, simply because our customers bear the weight of the company's problems on their shoulders. They're dealing with terrorism, active shooters, product recalls, supply chain disruptions. So outside of that, we are based out of Charlotte. We are a woman-owned business, and we work with firms from all across various industries and sectors, from nonprofit to corporate, government, retail, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. You see why I'm so excited to partner with Ms. Vanessa and her organization and moving this forward. Again, I am Doug Harris, the CEO of Kaleidoscope Group. Been doing this work for 30 years, and again, still excited every morning as I get involved. As you can see, all of the different ways to connect with us here: Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. I wish I could say I was an expert on all of those, but I am not, but we are. So if you want to connect with us, please do, and we'll be looking forward to supporting you. The next slide.
Yes, this is just like I mentioned, a little bit about the organizations that we've had an opportunity to work with, and just to kind of show you some of our scope.
Okay, thank you. And then our next slide just says some of the organizations that we've worked with. Over these 30 years, we've worked with over 300 organizations, but this just gives you a different flavor for the various industries that we've touched base with on this topic, and able again to broaden our perspective in all different arenas around this subject. Okay?
So, what's the elephant in your room? Something brought you here today for this conversation. Something sparked you to want to be a part of, well, what's the winning formula for crisis management and diversity and inclusion? And what I like to remind people of is that an elephant, which is typically something that's sitting in an organization that some of us can or cannot see, it can either create the crisis or it can magnify your crisis. So as we walk through today's webinar, just keep in mind, what's the elephant that's in your room? What are the things that you see in your work environment? You may even discover that you have elephants that you didn't know about before today's conversation started. How do you discover those elephants? Because you can't solve for it if we don't know that they're actually there. And then why do elephants exist? And who takes ownership of those so we can continue to move the organization in a forward direction? So I like to start with data and information because I think it's important to level set on the conversation. So why is crisis management so important? Well, simply because being unprepared is a costly mistake. Typically, businesses lose over $70 million over a 5-year period due to downtime. So when we don't take the time to prepare on the proactive side, we spend much more money on the reactive side. Typically, over 50% of businesses without a business continuity and crisis management program fail within 3 years post-crisis. So why is this important? Small businesses employ over 50% of America's workforce. So when we don't have the proper plans and programs in place, we put working Americans, everyday people, out of a job. So if we look at the coast of Florida, right, or Houston, Texas, right, with all the hurricanes and the natural disasters that have occurred over the past couple of years, what's the impact back to those organizations, but more importantly, to the people that actually work there? And lastly, what I like about this slide is that it speaks to the intangible risks when we think about crisis management. Over 50% of businesses who have experienced a crisis took the strongest hit to their corporate reputation and employee morale. These are two of the things that are the hardest to build, but the quickest to actually fail. So what can we do to be proactive, to mitigate this and to prevent this from happening?
So when we look at the diversity and inclusion intersection with crisis management, let's go back to that thought process of what is the elephant in the room? And not only just what is the elephant in the room, but how do we see that elephant? So when the elephant is in the room, if you're looking at it from the front, there's one viewpoint. If you're looking at it from the side, it's another viewpoint. From the back, it's another viewpoint. On the other side, it's another viewpoint. So what diversity and inclusion does is it helps people to understand how to look at that elephant from all different angles. And when you see crisis take place, one of the first things experts in our field would say, well, wow, well, who was in the room that made them look at that way? They didn't realize this, they didn't realize that. And the reality is the people in the room were probably making the best decisions that they can make based on what they see. But if you don't have diversity in the room, you're not going to see it all. So we have to think about diversity and inclusion not as a separate entity that we go through twice a year to discuss differences, but how are we valuing it and leveraging it within all of our processes, within all of our strategies, within risk management, so we can be proactive and gain and further enhance our reactive abilities to these challenges. I have just woken up in the middle of the night with some of this stuff that is taking place currently, and we'll be sharing that saying, wow, that could so easily have been avoided with different viewpoints coming to the table. And so what we want to do is kind of discuss some of those things and just, have a dialogue around how these two connect to really make a difference and move forward in a different manner. So again, hopefully the risk management or crisis management that we have to get involved with can be avoided.
So crisis management is simply your reputation, your profitability, and your ability to operate. When those three things are compromised, you are in a crisis. And so oftentimes companies don't know, well, when am I in a crisis? Because sometimes we start with maybe 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3, or there is a negative occurrence that has occurred, right? So a lot of the work that we do on the preparation side is helping organizations to understand what constitutes a crisis for my company. And then once we understand that, well, then who's responsible for doing what? How do we execute? Who are the key players that need to be a part of the conversation? Because what happens is crisis management transitions into business continuity. And that is essentially, if you look at your profit and loss statements, what are the key drivers that are driving your company, right? Those are processes, those are functions, because they actually run your business. But then you have critical assets like people, technology, your data, and the facilities that you operate in and out of each and every day. So crisis management is meant to protect those things, but also to help you understand how do we continue to do business 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, 2 years out. So this is really something that we have to get a hold of on the front end to really help us to understand that. And then crisis communications is a part of that conversation, because once the crisis happens, I have to communicate. I have stakeholders, I have employees, I have customers, I have shareholders, vendors, and suppliers. Each of them requires a different conversation, and they all want something. We have to understand who are we as an organization and how does our response go in alignment with that. And then also crisis leadership, right? Every leader in the organization has a role. And then if you're on the board of directors, well, what's your role in crisis management versus the actual leadership team? Because when you run a business, the role of the board is much different. So the same thing happens in crisis management. So these are things that we like to bring to the forefront. And the reason why is you have to be aware. In order to create change, we first have to know and understand and to be aware, and then we can go forward.
Yes. What comes to mind as you're talking, I really appreciate what you just shared, Vanessa, is in the work of diversity and inclusion, we're frequently trying to find places to make sure that our work is very important. So our work is very known within the talent management cycle, helping people understand people and get people from different backgrounds. But it's also very crucial in this arena of crisis management. But we're not often presenting our work as an asset to the space of crisis management. But when we talk about reputation, profitability, ability to operate, those are key things that are part of our work, but it's not seen as evidently as it could be. And so when you start bringing these different conversations to the table, it gives an organization even another reason to say, wow, this is an important topic for us to address to help us be most effective in what we do.
Absolutely.
Okay. So again, what is diversity and inclusion? Diversity and inclusion is just a variety of ability, skills, experiences, and cultural backgrounds in all stakeholders. So again, when you have that cross section of people from all different backgrounds, all different dimensions, giving input to an organization and making sure that they're valued and leveraged, which goes into inclusion, is how do you value and leverage those differences to achieve superior results? And when this is taking place, as it relates to crisis management or any other operational factor for your business, you just come up with better decisions that again lead to, as was mentioned earlier, profitability, reputation, ability to operate. So again, we're very excited to be a part of this. And what we're going to do now is just transition a little bit and begin to talk about some of the recent occurrences that have taken place in our society that really are impacted by this winning formula, as we're calling it, between diversity and inclusion and crisis management. Vanessa?
Yeah, Yeah. So one of the examples that we're going to start with today is one that's most recent, which is Starbucks. And so when I look at Starbucks, I'm looking from a crisis management perspective and really the response from the executive in this situation. So as many of you know, Starbucks in Philadelphia, 2 men went to jail, 2 people of color. And as a result of sitting in a Starbucks and not ordering anything yet. And social media has responded in outrage, and there's just been so much conversation about it. And I think largely because of Starbucks' global footprint, right? But what I love about it, and what I call this, is a crisis managed well. Because as an executive and as a person who is leading an organization, it starts with you. And there have been so many examples of other leaders who have not responded as he has. But what I've enjoyed about watching this CEO is he showed up at the jail. And that's a commitment. He's also committed to, we're going to close over 8,000 stores to provide training, because this is not acceptable to our organization and who we say that we are. And that really goes back into the conversation of crisis management, diversity and inclusion. These are not siloed conversations that need to be happening across the organization. We have to think about how we impact other people, whether it's employees or whether it's our customers. But more importantly, your response has to tie back into our organizational strategy, our vision, and our mission. How does crisis management help us to do what we do best? So this is one example that I absolutely love, and just to be able to see the change, but also the willingness to take an impact to their bottom line in order to make a difference and to be a leader in this space.
Yeah, what comes to mind is me, is I have been speaking quite a bit around the Starbucks scenario, and many times, even with good intentions, there's a real negative impact. And what we will so frequently find leaders doing is defending their intentions, or what we were meaning to do versus totally understand the impact and respond appropriately, as Vanessa discussed. But then I also think back to a couple of things here with Starbucks. One is proactively, if there had been diverse representation in that store, might there have been a different reaction? Because when you're fearful of something, you react a certain way. And sometimes if you have people around you seeing the world differently, they can minimize that fear. So there's going to be a need after this powerful initial reaction for them to continue reinforce the importance of diversity and inclusion with representation in leadership, spending communities, supplier diversity, looking at all the factors to make sure that their initial response will be followed up with some real important things moving forward. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hi, all. This is Melanie. I have a question that came through that might be relevant right now. So we had a question relating to what can we do as a training or training purposes, so we don't have to make up these types of actions on the fly. So really being proactive with it.
One of the things that comes to mind in the crisis management space is, what are the top 3 to 5 risks that can happen to your organization? And I love that this picture's on the screen now, because I can almost guarantee you that back in the 90s, the NFL probably didn't think about to kneel or to not kneel, and whether that would be a risk that the organization is currently in the middle of. So if you look at your market, if you look at the way that the world is evolving, and if you look at your business as a whole, what are the things that can happen to your organization? And then what you have to do secondly is you have to put those key decision makers in a room. The first reason why is company leaders are typically at the top. They see a very different perspective of the organization than everybody else. And so they don't know typically, well, what are we doing every single day that may cause us to have a risk that we find ourselves in the middle of, and then we have to respond to a crisis. So we have to make them aware. Secondly, once they're in that training, right, and you're talking through things and you're having a simulation and you're walking through that, that's really where change begins to happen. You get to show them, here's how this policy, or here's how this perspective within the organization makes an impact from a crisis management standpoint. And that's how change begins to happen. So it's really through training and awareness that we begin to see change.
Mm-hmm. The other thought that comes to mind, great answer, Vanessa, is that many times if your voice is not the main voice in any scenario, that voice can kind of get overridden and not really respected. And there are so many organizations who have people speaking to things or need to get more diverse people speaking to things, but they also need to listen to what's being spoken to. Because if people aren't heard, they will go to extreme measures to get their voice heard and addressed. And so the education component of it begins to say, value that unique perspective. Don't look at things through the lens of, well, how do I see what they're saying? Just understand what they're saying and respecting it and making moves in accordance. And again, I think when you put that out there as a premise of this is who we are as an organization, we value and leverage our differences. It's not just like majority rules, but all opinions, and that weighted opinion, which can be specifically aware of some of the things, even in this situation of the picture we're looking at, there's a lot of different viewpoints. And we attempt to say, well, what is the right way? Well, it's not really about what is the right way. How do we understand all these different perspectives and come up with a combined way that values all of those? It's a different way of coming up with decisions being made, but I think that's necessary to put that premise out to make sure that you're not running into these scenarios that have that great negative impact.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I like that. Absolutely, Vanessa. We're doing well here. Yes, yes.
Interesting photo, especially kind of looking at today's times and this hashtag #MeToo sexual abuse and misconduct. And what I've learned is since Harvey Weinstein's challenges around rape, sexual abuse, and misconduct, the hashtag #MeToo movement has actually been seen over 825,000 times across the country. So what I'd like to remind people of is this is not something new. This isn't something that started yesterday. I think social media did a great thing by bringing awareness and bringing it to the forefront, right? But essentially, Bob and Harvey Weinstein were the owners of the Weinstein Company. And back in October of 2017, when 60 women came out and talked about their experiences with him, 3 days later, they were fired by their board of directors. But the challenge that I see is that, again, it goes back to the leadership in crisis management. Everything starts at the top within the company. And that was a culture that was created and accepted for years, right? And then now we're starting to hear about the backlash and the impact of that. So to Doug's point about diversity and inclusion, how are we being inclusive, right? How are we bringing in different people from different perspectives to help mitigate these types of risks? But then more importantly, what about the people? What about the people that he's worked with across the years, them and their families? What's the impact back to them? And those are the things that I see when I look at this.
Yes, that's powerful. I think also when you start looking at power, and in our society, power has always, or the perception has been that power operates around different rules. And I think through social media and the different ways we're able to get messages out, we're addressing power. And when you start to address power, there's a big impact there. And I think the other thing that we see occurring in situations like this is we're not just going after individuals, but we're going after institutions that allow individuals to exist in this way of performing these negative behaviors. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we're going after the president of universities, we're going after whomever is just letting this happen and trying to push this to the side. If we're really going to create an environment that avoids crisis, it's going to have to deal with accountability at all levels. And now that this is coming to the forefront, it's creating a whole different view of how to operate, not only in the workplace, but in society overall. And it helps us to empower our work, which is still, again, proactive around creating outcomes, But if we can get this known through these scenarios, it's another way to position our capability in organizations. Mm-hmm.
So you guys may remember this back from earlier this year in January, where a Black Swedish child was modeling a hoodie titled "The Coolest Monkey in the Jungle." And what's ironic is that the parents had a very different perspective than the brand collaborators, social media. I mean, even NFL and NBA teams responded in outrage because the thought process was, how did this get from marketing to the customer? How did this get to the consumer? And what happened is this thing went global. It went from China to Africa to the United States, because I think it just continues to depict a picture of a African American or a Black Swedish person, and not in a very positive context. And so several of their stores were closed. They had riots in one of the cities as people responded in outrage, which is typically what happens when we see things that we don't agree with or that don't align with our own core values. Different people have different responses. And what I see from this that's a bit different than what I see from Starbucks is I never saw the CEO. I never saw the head of communications. I never saw them address this and to try to bring some understanding and provide some clarity and some context to the conversation. So I think this is an interesting example of how, you know, even when we're in marketing or merchandising, who are the key players that are at the table and who are a part of these conversations before it hits the consumer?
Yes. Yeah, this is powerful. What comes to mind for me as I look at the sweatshirt example is I know there were some people that they actually talked to who were African American and maybe didn't see a big problem. And it's the difference between having a diverse organization and, you know, one Black person, you know. And so many times we'll say, well, we talked to the Black person. They say, it was cool, so put it out there. Well, you need to maybe have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 so that you get varying viewpoints. So there's a difference between a diverse organization and having a single person represented. And sometimes the viewpoint of that single person can speak for many and do it inappropriately. And I'm not even saying right or wrong for that person, but this was a major faux pas that had a major reaction to it because enough viewpoints were not on the table to be able to address it effectively.
Yeah. And lastly, immigration and customs enforcement. So there's lots of things going on with that organization, but one of the things that I've looked at just through some research, this really ties back into the conversation of sexual abuse and misconduct. So what I saw is that there has been from the years of 2010 to 2017, over 127,000 complaints across the organization, and 71% of those went unanswered. So as the leader of that organization, they're actually responsible for being able to manage those concerns and the challenges that are happening specifically in the youth detention centers across the country. And so the challenge I see is you have people that are immigrants that are in prisons and in jails across the country, but that does not give us a right to violate people no matter what. As I dug deeper into the federal government space and really what's happening across all industries and all sectors, what I found was that not only are there women who are being challenged with sexual abuse and misconduct in the work environment, but it's also men. And it really enlightened me to understand that it's happening no matter what your gender is too. So I thought that was something interesting. And then if I think about what's been going on in the news lately with children being locked in cages across the country, right? So that, I mean, it really reinforces the value and the opportunity to make sure that we're having key players at the table, people who are families, people who are children, just to have a more well-rounded discussion so that when we approach these decisions, we're doing so from an inclusive perspective.
Yes. And, you know, the argument becomes, they try to take it to, well, we're trying to protect the border. We try to take it to this big place, but leaving out respect of people in that process. And so there's a mindset, and we see it so frequently around how much respect certain populations get over other populations is very distinct. And we'll go to a rule and say the rule says this, but that rule is ineffectively or inappropriately implemented, which creates some of the challenges. So some of these things that are taking place today within immigration and customs, it's not just about what we're trying to achieve, but it's the approach we're taking. And this one feels to be extreme, but these kinds of examples have gone on for a while. And then once they get known, the impact on, reputation and all those factors as we're experiencing today can be unbelievable. So again, just another example in this crisis management place that can be hopefully shielded with a different way of approaching it initially before it gets to that level.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? Say, go ahead, you can say it. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
And so this really brings the conversation back to, well, how does crisis management align with the organizational purpose and the strategy? And really, this is all the work that has to be done on the front end. When I look at this, I see stakeholders, I see employees, I see customers, I see shareholders, I see different people that want different things, and I see different ways that we have to communicate with them and to be effective. And so from a crisis management standpoint, these are the things that we look to do. How do we align with the organizational strategy? If we say that we honor God in all we do, then awesome. Then that means our crisis response has to show that. That means, if we're looking at Glassdoor or comments about the organization, how do our internal employees see how we're managing things that are internal, also external? So this is just really just kind of reinforces the value from the previous slides. This is why you have these conversations and bring the key players to the table in the beginning versus on the back end.
Yes, thank you. And then we look at how does diversity and inclusion align with organizational purpose and strategy. As I go back to my 30 years in this work, we started off just coming in based on challenges, based on someone told a bad joke. There was a sign in the plant. We need to come in and do this work. And now we have elevated our work to align with the organization's directions, purpose, and strategy. So when you look at organization success, if you don't have this lens lined up with it, it will impact the overall view of success. And so often we're trying to empower diversity and inclusion. And it's hard to empower it where it's just seen as an activity versus being linked into the direction, the strategy, and the purpose for the organization existing. So we, again, as Vanessa mentioned, try to get this done very early in the work to be able to get this integrated into the direction of the organization.
Hi team, this is Melanie. Just wanted to throw a question out there. And so one of our audience asked, how do you encourage an environment to embrace crisis management when you aren't a leader in the organization?
That's a great question.
Go ahead, Vanessa. I think you got a great answer too. Go ahead.
Right. So that's key because, like I said, oftentimes the executives have a different view and a different standpoint. And so when you're internal to it, you see things from a different standpoint. So one of the ways that I've worked with the company to be able to do that, I had a manager who was responsible for security. And there were policies for this organization that they would let people go. And so they would give them a 30-day window, but they would let them come into the company. They would let them walk in for the next 30 days. They had access to the IT servers, to the physical assets of the company, right? But the challenge is that the decision makers were unaware that that policy created not only an information security risk, but also a physical security risk to the company. Because if I let someone go and I tell you, hey, you have 30 days, and then You may or may not be able to have a job here. I don't know what your frame of mind is. You can be an active shooter. You may have ill intent, right? So the way that we did that is lead by influence, simply. You have to provide awareness to your leaders and work that conversation up, and also be able to show them the value. Here's the impact to the organization. Here's the intangible risks. Here's the physical risks. And then as that conversation continues to evolve, typically leadership team members will take the opportunity to have the conversation, but you really have to first be aware, help them understand what the value is, and then bring them in a room together where you can start to see and create change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I would add to that quickly is that when you start looking at change in a culture, it takes beliefs, behaviors, processes, practices, and policies. So all those things have to be addressed. And I think the beginning of it, though, it starts with just listening. Mm-hmm. And as leaders are leading, they need to hear and understand the viewpoints and value the viewpoints of everyone speaking. And when you set that tone under the environment that you lead, that creates energy within itself that people will now be a part of the crisis management prevention area, which we'll talk about. There are people in organizations seeing things, but unheard, not valued. They're like, well, forget it. I'm not going to say anything. We'll wait for them to fall down, and I'll laugh when that happens. And we're like, well, why didn't you say anything? Well, because I was not valued and respected. So as leaders, how do you create a culture, an environment, an area within the context of what you lead where that's not the case? And I think it can play a major role in preventing some of these things from occurring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I love about this slide is that it really talks truly about business resilience and what it is. So oftentimes, many companies have pockets of resilience. They have physical security, health and safety, crisis management, business continuity, risk, diversity and inclusion, information security. But the challenge is that we don't come together and communicate. And as a result of that, we're all managing risk in our silos, but we're not coming together for a cohesive conversation. So one of the ways that we've helped companies to be able to solve for this is to bring the people within the organization who own these processes, who own these functions, and have a steering committee. And this steering committee typically leads risk as a whole for the organization, because every chief risk officer has a conversation about risk at a minimum of 3 to 4 times a year. And so it's up to this steering committee to be able to look at risk holistically, but also to be inclusive. Well, how do we bring in diversity and inclusion to that conversation? Yes. Do your organizations have these key players at the table? How frequently are they talking, not just about the tangible risks, but also about the intangible risks?
Yes. And so if you're in the area of diversity and inclusion as a practitioner, this is another conversation that you need to be a part of. I don't know how many of you have thought about, well, should I be in the business resilience discussion, or should I just be in the performance succession planning discussion? And I'm not downplaying that at all, but the more discussions you can be a part of, it empowers all of the additional work that you do and drives more of a commitment to it, because that clear line to organizational impact is designed there.
Yeah. Yep. And the reason why that I'll ask you that, when you're a part of the conversation on the front end, you help to shape the organization to see, well, what's our risk? Well, hey, we have a location that may be impacted by social economic differences, or we may have challenges with race. You may be that voice that can help bring that conversation to the front, as opposed for them kind of being surprised on the back end and not knowing, well, hey, this is an issue and a challenge within our company. How do we help to solve for that?
Very much so. Agree with that totally. Thank you. Absolutely, matter of fact, is what I
say. So this picture helps us to see whether you have poorly planned and or well practiced. And so simply, if you're on the top part of this chart, you probably have not taken the time to have the discussions, to bring the key players to the table, to make sure that you have the proper documentation that helps you to see, well, here's my risk, here's how I spot it, here's the drivers of how we're going to help to solve for it, and here's the strategies to help mitigate risk. What happens when we don't take our time to proactively prepare, we spend more time reacting, and we spend even greater time recovering. When we're on the bottom half of this chart, you've made the investment on the front end, which goes back to those risks that we talked about in the very early stages. Over $70 million in lost revenue over a 5-year downtime, over 50% of people losing employee morale and corporate reputation. That's as a result of being on the top half of this chart.
Yep. And, you know, one of the realities is I'm listening to you, Vanessa, we can never eliminate all challenges. However, you can be aware of them coming so you can manage them a lot better. And so there's not diversity and inclusion, crisis management. It's always going to say, you know, if we do this, everything will just go away. No, it won't go away, but you will be proactively addressing it. People will feel the confidence to bring their challenges to the organization because they know there's a commitment to address it and not let it become a hindrance to the organization's success.
That's an excellent point. I had a leadership team that I was working with, and we were building their crisis management team. And one of the leaders said, well, hey, I've never been in an active shooter. I never experienced a data breach. And my hope is that you never have to do that. But what I told her is, the point is that you and your team work together so that you all can have some cohesiveness as a crisis management team, so that when things happen, you work together to help solve challenges and problems and to get the organization on the other side of that. So absolutely.
Yes. No question. And what ends up happening in working through that, you become stronger as a team to work together in general and be more productive, effective, profitable, operate more effectively. All of those things take place through addressing this in a proactive way. Mm-hmm.
So this chart really sums up the why. On the top left at the 4, something bad, or this is where the organization is, and you go down to a 3, the negative occurrence has occurred. And then from that point, you get down into mode of crisis. So if we look at Starbucks, right? Something happened, person went to jail, outrage in social media. Now we're in full-blown crisis mode. And it's right at that moment where those 2 dots are by crisis, where that's the defining moment. That's what people care about. What will I say? How will we respond? Because what happens at that moment will guide your reputation curve going back up. If we look at Starbucks, if we look at H&M, if we look at immigrations and customs, right? Look at all the different things that people have not had an opportunity to get a handle on, and what the impact has been back to the organization.
Yes, very much so. This is powerful. Yep.
So how do we do that? How do we build our reputation and build it back up? Simply, it's about earning trust, right? Assess the situation, prioritize what we did or did not do well, embrace it and really own it. And that's really where the accountability is. Who are we? And then how are we exuding that through our response? Implement controls, implement new measures, make changes. And then lastly, you have to be able to measure that. We can't grow if we're not measuring how we're doing that.
Yes. And each of you are probably leading different organizations, and what that cycle might look like could be a little different, but the strategy and the factors are very similar as we approach that.
Yeah. So one of the last things that we'll get into for today's conversation is just a tool to use. The reason that we created this tool for this strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats, as well as the PEST analysis, is, like I said, one of the unique qualifiers for us is disruptive innovation and design thinking. And we have that as a partnership through Faster Glass. And what we did is we took the strategic plan and looked at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so you'll see that on the top half of this chart, the threats and the opportunities column. But then on the left side, we looked at one possible trend, because there's several, for how we can look and see our risks. So political, environmental, social, and technological. And the reason why I like this is I can't solve for a risk if I don't see it, which goes back to the elephant. Where are we looking? If we're not looking for it, then we can't solve for it. So I love this model because it helps you to see the different categories that risk can exist in. So
Yes.
what do you think?
Yeah, I think, so often when we bring up the topic of diversity, we'll think that we're just talking about race or gender or sexual orientation. But when we start talking about the differences and the different ways people see things, we have to look at all the different lines of difference. So what is the social impact, the technology impact? All of these different groups have to have a voice at the table to avoid the risk. And, I remember one time, even in my small organization, we decided to terminate their relationship with us and did not do the necessary things attached to the technology associated with that, and had to go through a major process of being able to secure our information, going to court and things of that nature. Now, as a D&I firm, that's not my lens. I value and leverage differences, but I'm like, okay, I'm assuming that's going to be okay. So this concept of diversity and inclusion within the crisis management platform has to hear voices, not just that are demographically different, but voices that are different from so many angles to make sure you're getting a pure lens. And unfortunately, still today, there are voices that are devalued over others and that don't get valued until that negative impact has occurred, which then will bring you to a webinar of this nature, trying to find out how to do it a little bit differently. Yeah. Fantastic. You like that? Look at it. She's laughing. So the big question, I believe, is, how can we help? How can we help you address some of these things that we have been talking about and kind of do it in more of a proactive way versus a reactive way? And then also, as we're thinking about this, what is that connection between diversity and inclusion and at the same time crisis management and all of the unique things that Vanessa has talked about, which take crisis management to a whole new level of achieving business resilience versus just staying out of trouble. And so first you have to be able to identify the threats, the vulnerability, and impacts. And I'll say it again, you got to get this information around this from as many places as you can. And we have tools that allow you to do, quote unquote, a risk or a crisis management assessment to just say, where are we today? What things have we not thought about? And I'm sure no matter which organization we do this with, there are many things they are aware of and many things they are not. So how do we get that on the table so we know how to address it? Next, we have to evaluate the effectiveness of control and safeguards, okay? We got to evaluate the effectiveness of the controls and safeguards that we have in place. We have to understand the organization's exposure to loss. And many times we don't realize it until it's much too late. So the more proactive we are, the more we can plan for it. And from a cost standpoint alone, there's a major savings. But when you start getting involved with reputation and those factors, that can last forever. And so you really want to be able to address that. You want to assess, state, and prioritize the level of risk. And again, sometimes not knowing it yourself, you might not be able to do that well. You might blow off, oh, that's not that big. But you need another lens to be able to talk about what that can be. And the reality is, if you are proactive, you can stop it from being that big, but you at least want to be aware as you're kind of implementing these things. And then finally, as Vanessa has mentioned a couple of times, implement the controls to prevent, deter, and mitigate risks. And again, what those are, each of you probably on this call work in different environments, dealing with different kind of associations and organizations, corporations. There's different things you're addressing. That is something that we could tailor for you that gives you a better understanding of how to approach it. I don't know if there's anything you would add, Vanessa, as it relates to how we can help.
I think you summed it up well.
Good. Thank you. That was my goal, was to get your approval. So I feel much better now that has happened. Okay. Very, very good. I've been learning that stuff. All right. Next slide.
So it really just goes back to, what is the elephant that's in your room? As you've looked at and heard through today's conversation, Had there been things that that have been brought to your attention that you haven't thought about? And if
Yes.
so, then I think that this is a great place to really start to have some conversations and some dialogue. And like Doug said, it starts with just simply listening and communicating.
Yes, no doubt. And the reality for most of you all, if you have been listening well, is you really don't know what the elephant is. And even if there is an elephant, you don't know all the angles to it. And that's even if you have the best of processes. So thinking about these topics will just give you more insight as it relates to how to address this, how to move forward with it, to make sure, again, you can key in on what's most important for you, which is producing results for your customers, reducing results for your visitors, if you're mission-based, whatever organization you might be in, concentrating on that versus reacting to some of these challenges. Yep.
All right, Vanessa and Doug, this is Melanie. One question that we have, we've talked a lot about how to be proactive, but let's say something either has already happened or could potentially happen. Like, what does that response time look like? And is there a point that it's too late to respond to something?
Yeah.
It's never too late.
Never too late. Never too late. And even if you are late, apologize for being late. But there's never too late to go out there. And then after the response, I would share this, and please add your viewpoint to it, Vanessa. Learn from the response. Sometimes we respond and like, whew, I'm glad that's over. No. Now you need to have that next discussion like, hey, there's something else that's going to be coming. How do we get more proactive around responding, but also learning from the response so that it can create a different behavior in the future? And so again, a part of it is that reaction, and then a part of it is learning so you can avoid some of those challenges down the road. Yeah.
One of the things that never waste a crisis. So no matter what happens, no matter when it is, there is an opportunity to learn and to educate the organization on how can we make sure that this does not happen again. Yeah.
And I think one of the things I would add that just came to mind for me is, these things are important. And people will realize, and I love the way you talked about Starbucks, when things are important, so we're not perfect and they're not perfect, but they want to know that when things take place, you are responding in an important manner versus just a reactionary stay out of trouble manner. So please go at it. If you're late and you didn't realize how important it is, come back, say something. But when you say it, commit to what you're saying so that you can follow it up with the appropriate factors to make a difference as you move forward.
Absolutely. And that ties back into earning trust.
Yes.
That's really what it's
earning
about.
Trust. Yep. I trust Vanessa. That's a good thing.
Thank you, Melanie.
That's a good thing. I trust you too, Melanie. I want you to feel like.
I was like, wow, I work for you.
Exactly. I trust you too. Yep. And I think what that does is it allows for openness and communication. People can share their truth, and you respect and value people. So at the end of the day, you can avoid some of these things, and then at the same time respond to them when they occur in a positive way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. One last question. And so I know this is all very internal within your organization. Is there a similar formula for people that you partner with? Or maybe that you as like a vendor or something, because those types of associations also affect organizations. So Vanessa, I think that might be pointed at you mainly, and then Doug, I don't know.
Right, Zach. I got to check out Vanessa's risk portfolio to make sure she don't get us in trouble.
So what I love about your question is the need to extend the conversation to others that you're doing business with. I have a company that we work with that depends heavily on vendors and suppliers for a lot of their products and services, which impact the end user and their bottom line. So the question that I typically ask them is, what is the business continuity and crisis management plan for your vendors and your suppliers? And if you don't have that, If you don't have that fluid conversation, and if your leadership team and their leadership team are not discussing that, then that's definitely an opportunity, because that is a supply chain. Whether you're a small business or a big business, we have a supply chain, right? There's things that are coming in and out. So you want to be ahead of those conversations, because what happened in 2012 in Japan with the Fukushima earthquake, a large part of the automobile industry happens in Japan. And people didn't think about your tier 2, your tier 3, your tier 4 suppliers who were underwater. We couldn't get paint for months. Those things impact your organization. So you have to think about that. Do you have any sole source vendors and suppliers? What does that look like? If I look at the aircraft world, right? You can't just pick a new supplier and build an airplane. It's not how it works. It has to go through an FAA certification. So think about the impact back to your business and really what that process looks like.
Absolutely. Yep. Good stuff. Good stuff. I won't even add to that.
All right. Thank you again, Vanessa and Doug. I know I've taken a lot away, and we've already gotten some good feedback. So for those of you that are thinking about, okay, what's next? I'm really intrigued about what I've heard today. You can schedule a free 30-minute call with myself from Kaleidoscope Group. And we can even throw Vanessa in there if you have some really specific questions. I know she's always open to that. And you can do that by visiting kgdiversity.com/let's connect to schedule that call. And next slide. There's my picture, so you know what I look like. And so when you go ahead and get that confirmation in your inbox, you will get an opportunity to add that to your calendar. Be sure my email, melanie.munoz@kgdiversity.com, is not in your spam folder, because I'm always sending out great stuff and you don't want to miss it. And you will be able to add that to your calendar right away. And I look forward to speaking with you.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you much.
Thank you,
Look
Doug
forward
and
to hearing from you.
Vanessa and Melanie.
Thank you.
All right. Take care now. Bye-bye.